Certo?
Pronto, estamos ao vivo.
Pois
Elton,
bem,
por favor.
Pois não, então...
Senhora...
Irmã Miriam, por favor.
Senhoras e senhores, boa noite. Em nome da Faculdade Damas, quero saudar com boas-vindas afetuoso todos os que nos acompanham pelas redes sociais. Ao senhor ilustríssimo palestrante, nosso muito obrigada por abrilhantar esta noite entre nós. A Faculdade Damas sente-se honrada com a sua presença e com os ilustres ensinamentos de Vossa Senhoria, um ilustríssimo acadêmico que nos visita. Muito e muito obrigada. Passamos neste momento a palavra ao nosso coordenador do curso de Relações Internacionais, o professor Dr. Elton Gomes.
Muito obrigado, irmã Miriam. Muitíssimo boa noite a todos. É uma alegria e uma satisfação muito grande poder recebê-los para a 8ª edição do Congresso Internacional de Relações Internacionais de Pernambuco, o nosso CIRIPE, um evento que já se converteu em um importantíssimo espaço de discussão acadêmica para temas políticos, econômicos, securitários e socioculturais nas relações internacionais. Temos contribuído bastante com o debate intelectual, trazendo sempre grandes especialistas e estudiosos nas diferentes áreas do conhecimento para abordar temas de relevo nas relações internacionais. Esse ano, como não poderia deixar de ser, refletimos sobre a pandemia e seus impactos para a condução das relações internacionais. So, tonight, we are honored to welcome Professor Alan Greene from the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom, who will open the Congress speaking to the audience about the pandemic and the crisis in international relations. So, I hand the floor over to Professor Pedro Cavalcante, then he can introduce the speaker.
Boa noite a todos, boa noite a todas que estão nos assistindo agora pelo YouTube da Faculdade Damas. É uma honra estar falando aqui na mesa de abertura e, como bem colocou o professor Elton, o nosso palestrante convidado é o Dr. Alan Greene, da Universidade de Birmingham. So, now I'm going to speak English to Dr. Alan understand us. Yes. Before give the floor to Dr. Alan Greene, I would like to introduce him. Yeah. First of all, Alan Greene is PhD by University College Dublin School of Law, and he's a reader in constitutional law and human rights at Birmingham Law School, specializing in constitutional law and human rights. His research focuses on the limits of constitutionalism, judicial review, and the role of courts in vindicating the rule of law. He explores these themes in the context of emergency powers, counterterrorism, constitutional power, and judicial protection of human rights more generally. His latest book is Emergency Powers in the Time of Pandemic, published by Bristol University Press last year, and explores how states can best protect human rights and the rule of law while responding to a pandemic. So, Dr. Alan Greene, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And now I'll give the floor to Dr. Alan. Thank you once more.
Many thanks, Professor, and many thanks for the invite. And apologies that I don't speak Portuguese. I speak English and Irish, but I doubt speaking Irish would be of help to anybody. So I have a PowerPoint presentation that I would like to share. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation. Yes. Okay. Excellent.
All right. Not yet. Actually.
Not
yet.
Not yet.
Can you check in the inferior bar share, mic, cam, exit. So you can click on
near to the rotary icon.
Share. 1 second. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
No,
you have to. Okay. It's on. It's on.
Can you see it?
You can see it now.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you. So, as mentioned, I'm a lawyer by trade, not international relations. So I'm very much coming at this from a legal perspective. But my research is very much interested in, I suppose, what we would call a socio-legal perspective, and particularly the limits of law. And when we're talking about emergency powers, the links between law and politics are really intertwined. And a lot of the commentary on emergency powers during the pandemic, I think, have overplayed law's hands, particularly in terms of how we shape and frame and understand the pandemic. So ordinarily, when we talk about emergency powers, we tend to talk from a legal perspective and from a human rights perspective. We tend to talk about how these powers are harmful to things like human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. The pandemic has forced me to have a bit of a rethink about my research and about emergency powers. And it's made me understand, I think, the importance of how actually properly, formally declared emergencies can have a role in responding to serious crises like the pandemic. So the key themes of my presentation today are firstly about whether formal states' declarations of states of emergency, both in domestic law and international law under international human rights treaties, are the best way to confront a pandemic. And then my second key theme is to maybe discuss and try and unpack how pandemics are different to national security emergencies. Because up until February 2020 of last year, most research on emergency powers has been dominated by national security. Sometimes economic crises have fed in as well, but mostly we've been focused on national security crises. And I think that has really affected our understanding of the best way to approach and confront pandemics in law. So, very brief history lesson, and I'll try and fly through this as quickly as possible. But most emergency powers in constitutions and in international human rights treaties are influenced by the dictatorship of the Roman Republic. So the Roman Republic was a very complex system of checks and balances because it was afraid of the consolidation of power into one individual. It was afraid of the tyranny of kings. It had been founded on the basis of the expulsion of kings. So everything was designed to check power, including the ultimate office. The most important offices in the Republic were the councils. And 2 councils were elected at any one time each year, but each council had a veto over the other council. And that was to ensure this, to stop power being consolidated in one individual. However, in a time of crisis, this form of power division was considered to be disastrous. It would result in delayed decision-making, debate, and ultimately could lead to ruination. So in a time of emergency, the Romans appointed a temporary dictator to tackle the threat. And the threat was normally a military crisis. And the dictator would be appointed with powers essentially to act without constitutional constraints. So there was no check on their power. They had power over life and death, and there was no right to appeal over their decision. So it was a very powerful office, and therefore it was a very dangerous office. However, in order to stop absolute power corrupting the dictator, there were important checks on the office. So importantly, the person who decided that a dictator was needed could not themselves become a dictator. So we had a difference there. Secondly, there was a specific time limit on the dictatorship to 6 months. And also the dictator could not change the laws. And very often the dictator would step down before 6 months. They would step down once the threat was defeated. And the picture here we have on the right-hand side is a famous example of Cincinnatus. So he was a famous statesman who had retired to his farm. And this is him being asked to become the dictator to save Rome from invading threat. He accepted. And after 6 days, he stepped down. Once he defeated the threat, he stepped down and he was lauded as the hero of Rome. So what happened once the dictator stepped down was the powers disappeared. So it meant that there was no residue left in the constitutional order, in the legal order of the dictatorship. So it's essentially an emergency temporary resort to, I suppose, autocracy or the implementation of powers and measures that are essentially unconstitutional. They're the kind of measures that would not be permissible without a dictatorship. And what got me interested in emergency powers is the fact that if you can tell from my accent, I'm from Ireland. And Ireland's constitutional emergency provisions are quite stark, or at least they were quite stark. They've been amended somewhat. But essentially, it allowed any provision of the Constitution to be overwritten by a law passed by the legislature in a time of emergency. And actually, Ireland went into a state of emergency on the outbreak of World War II on the 2nd of September 1939. And this lasted until 1995, 56 years. It was eventually lifted once there was a ceasefire pertaining to the conflict in Northern Ireland. So Ireland has been in a state of emergency longer than it has been in a state of normalcy, rendering essentially all these constitutional norms contingent and at the discretion of the legislature. And this piqued my interest about this issue of permanent states of emergency and the relation between emergency powers and law. In international human rights law, we have a very clear definition of emergency under the European Convention on Human Rights. We also have a very similar definition in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and in the Inter-American Convention as well. And we talk about it allows in a time of war or of other public emergency threatening the life of the nation, that a state that's a party to the conventions can depart from the norms in the convention to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. And if we dig into emergency powers and various definitions of emergency, which is what I did in my PhD and my first book, I've established this definition of what constitutes a state of emergency. And this is a definition in a descriptive sense. So it's not the kind of definition I would hope to see entrenched in a legal constitution or a legal source. It's more for descriptive purposes than for normative purposes. So emergency, it's a crisis identified and labeled by a state to be of such magnitude that across the threat severity threshold, it necessitates urgent, exceptional, and therefore temporary actions that would not otherwise be permissible. So emergency powers are premised upon this basic assumption that we can separate a time of emergency from a time of normalcy. They're two separate states, and they're mutually exclusive. Okay, in theory, they shouldn't overlap at all. What we call normalcy is the empirical regularity. Normalcy should be the norm. Emergency should be the outlier. Emergency should be the exception. However, the ultimate goal of introducing emergency powers is to restore normalcy, i.e., we introduce these powers in order to defeat the threat at hand and restore the status quo that existed beforehand. So emergency powers are unpalatable. They're not nice. because they violate the very norms that make up normalcy. However, by introducing them, those powers should hopefully defeat the threat and restore normalcy. So emergency powers should ultimately negate the necessity of their own existence. Now, emergency powers can clearly, we can see that they're very constitutionally problematic because they interfere with things like the separation of powers or human rights. However, they can also be potentially beneficial from a human rights perspective, in the sense that emergency powers can quarantine these exceptional powers to exceptional situations. We say that these exceptional powers are only allowed when an emergency exists. If an emergency does not exist, then these powers can also not exist. Now, this separation of normalcy from emergency is helped with kind of a number of key assumptions. So key assumptions, for example, are the basis that we can identify an area that's been affected by an emergency that's from an area that hasn't been affected. So geographical demarcations. And sometimes emergency definitions will have those built into the definition. So, for example, we can identify an area affected by a natural disaster from an area not affected and apply the emergency powers only to that area. When we're talking about the emergencies in a national security context, then we're talking about how we can separate friend from enemy, i.e. we can clearly identify the threat to us, the invading army, for example. Now, you're probably thinking, okay, do these assumptions actually still hold? And yes, you're 100% correct. And one of the key themes in emergency powers research up until 2020 was this danger of permanent emergencies and whether the emergency paradigm is obsolete. Can we clearly separate normalcy from emergency anymore? So, for example, can we clearly identify areas that have been geographically affected by an emergency from those that haven't? In national security crisis, the threat of terrorism is seen as an international threat. The attacks on 9/11 in the United States triggered an emergency in the United Kingdom. We see how terrorism transcends borders. We see how even natural disasters aren't just solely limited to specific areas, because very often they require resources to tackle them from outside of these areas. Particularly economic crises and the issues of financial contagion spread rapidly. So the geographical identification of areas has broken down. Particularly the idea that we can separate friend from enemy has broken down too, because of the threat of terrorism, who look like us, who live amongst us. It's also difficult to know with certain manifestations of terrorism when that threat has actually been defeated, or at least that's the claim. And so this raises the question, or at least it raised the question, that the state of emergency was obsolete. It wasn't suitable for the kind of threats that we face today in society. However, the pandemic, to me, struck me as an almost ideal state of emergency, in the sense that it's almost very clear that, yes, this crisis exists. It's an objective threat that pretty much every reasonable person can agree exists. It follows mathematical models in the sense that, in the sense of exponential growth, that states that if the state does not do X, it is very clear that Y will occur. In a way that's not the same with national security emergency powers. The causal connection between the necessity of counterterrorism powers versus actual terrorist attacks happening or not happening is very, very weak. So it was almost screaming to me that actually maybe the pandemic is an ideal state of emergency. It's the very conditions that the formal declaration of a state of emergency could be used to deal with, to bring in all these powers that we don't, prima facie are not nice. So things like lockdown, forcing people to stay at home, the forced closure of businesses, the stopping of freedom of assembly. Yes, those things ordinarily are not palatable. They're not nice. However, they are absolutely, I would contend, and almost objectively, they are necessary to control the spread of the virus. So it almost was an ideal state of emergency. However, we can also see how even some of these assumptions break down in the pandemic. So particularly geographical spread and the idea that pandemics could be maybe geographically contained, or we can identify areas that have been affected from the pandemic versus areas that have not been affected, or that the decision to declare an emergency and introduce emergency powers is an objective decision, that it's a necessary decision. And we've seen with the pandemic that actually the global financial crisis that was triggered by the pandemic was almost the first indicator. It was almost the thing that was felt the most by most people in the world, rather than actually the disease itself. So the spread of the financial crisis in March 2020 was arguably much more rapid than the spread of the disease itself. So the geographical demarcations were breaking down. We also see political and subjective factors coming into play with regards to the different responses that states have taken to the pandemic. And the realization that actually a state's measures on their own is not going to be sufficient to control the pandemic. Even countries like Australia and New Zealand, with the strictest responses to the pandemic, have nevertheless had to have some interactions with the outside world, and that has resulted in some of the virus getting into these states. In Ireland, where I'm from, because there's two jurisdictions on the island of Ireland, the Republic's response to the pandemic, which was much stricter than the response of the United Kingdom. Nevertheless, because of the shared border, it meant that the UK's response affected the South, affected the Republic. But also the Republic, in terms of it had a mandatory hotel quarantine list. So if for certain people coming from certain states, they would have to, from countries with particularly high levels of COVID-19 or areas with variants of concern, so different variants of the virus, had to be quarantined. On the face of this would look like an objective power. They're picking countries with the higher rate of COVID. But in reality, the Department of Foreign Affairs had its input onto what countries went on this list or not. It wasn't wholly an objective criterion based on areas that were geographically impacted by the pandemic. A lot of different political and economic factors came into play, to the extent that most of the states that ended up on this list were from sub-Saharan Africa, which raised deep human rights concerns about the necessity at all of these measures. So even in this objective state of emergency, arguably, we see how subjective forces come into play and break down and require the interrogation of the necessity of certain emergency powers. In general as well, the question as to whether emergencies are an objective question is something that's deeply contested. Really, emergencies and the person declaring an emergency tells us as much about the person labeling them as an emergency as they do tell us about the actual crisis itself. And very often there are a lot of different subjective factors that come into play when deciding whether to label an event an emergency or not. So particularly national security crisis, there are a lot of very strong democratic factors in play, say in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, that push states to overreact and exact the burdens of this response, the infringement on human rights, on what's known as a suspect community, the community from which the terrorist threat is seen to stem from. As I'll talk about, however, the pressures, these subjective forces in the context of the pandemic, rather than actually maybe leaning towards the perpetuation of emergency powers, which as they manifest themselves in national security crisis, potentially push in the opposite direction and lead states to lift the measures too soon or not even react at all. And so when we look at the pandemic as an objective state of emergency, yes, it is, but it is also important to note that emergency powers can seep and can spread. And this ideal state of emergency, these exceptional powers that were brought in to deal with the pandemic and how they impact upon human rights, while we can identify the beginning of a pandemic quite easily, identification of the end is much more difficult. And as we've seen, this pandemic has already triggered a global financial crisis. And global financial crises are the very conditions in which you get a lot of civil unrest. And I think it's no coincidence that particularly in the United States and in Europe, in the United Kingdom, in 2020, we saw a large outbreak of mass protest in relation to the Black Lives Matter movement. I do not think it's a coincidence that this happened at a time of very high unemployment and unease and concern. And introducing emergency powers for the pandemic to control assemblies and public meetings, which I agree are 100% necessary, we shouldn't be seduced by the necessity of them in the pandemic, because pandemics and emergencies can trigger other crises. We can possibly find that identifying the end of the pandemic being much more difficult, and we can potentially find powers used to deal with the pandemic potentially being used to deal with less objective emergencies like political unrest. And that is deeply worrying. So if the emergency paradigm is obsolete, as some people claim it is, I argue that actually it's not. It's still potentially relevant. What are the alternatives? And as we'll see, not very many states actually declared emergencies under the European Court of Human Rights. Okay, instead, and some constitutions don't actually make provision for emergency powers. The US Constitution very famously does not. And this is what we call a business as usual model. This model insists that the same law applies in war as applies in peace. And this makes it sound like we're getting much better protections in a time of emergency as in a time of normalcy, because we're insisting upon the same standards in emergency as in normalcy. So it sounds attractive on the face of it. Emergencies don't justify any additional encroachment on human rights, democracy, etc. Also, we have another approach, which is the most common approach we've seen to the pandemic, which are what we know as legislative models. So at a constitutional level or international human rights level, there's been no declaration of emergency. So we are in an official state of normalcy. However, the state has introduced exceptional legislation that includes these kind of exceptional powers. And what makes them exceptional is that they might have been passed in a rush, so without the formal legislative process, or maybe the legislative process curtailed, or they might be subject to sunset clauses, i.e. to ensure that they're temporary. And this is the most common approach now seen to counterterrorism, and it's the most common approach seen to the pandemic. Now, as I've said before, both these approaches sound attractive because it sounds like the existing constitutional or international human rights law apply. The same law applies in war as applies in peace. And I sometimes call these banal emergency powers because they're emergency powers, but without formally declaring them emergency powers. They look like they're normal, but they are exceptional. Now, on the face of it, this looks like it's good for human rights. However, what we actually find, and this is a key example, is in the case of Re Korematsu, in the United States case, where even during World War II, it would suggest that the same law applies in war as applies in peace. So human rights standards in the US during World War II would be upheld to the same standards as pre-World War II. Whereas actually what we ended up with was the Supreme Court in this case essentially upholding the constitutionality of the detention of US citizens of Japanese descent and individuals of Japanese descent in concentration camps for the duration of the war. And this was found to be constitutional. So instead of actually raising the standard of human rights in a time of war to that in time of peace, what ends up happening with business as usual models is that they get recalibrated, and these norms get reinterpreted to allow the exceptional powers. However, it's done without that quarantining effect of a formal declaration of emergency, and it potentially leaves these powers to lie around to be used outside of an emergency situation. So my research in the context of the pandemic has looked at what is the best approach to accommodate lockdown powers and deal with lockdown during the pandemic. And I argue that the best way to do so is through derogation, to declare an emergency and derogate from the right to liberty as protected in Article 5. And I argue that this is important because we want to ensure that these powers are quarantined to exceptional situations, and that we shouldn't reinterpret Article 5 of the Convention to allow these powers, because that jurisprudence, that precedent, could potentially leak out and justify and be used by other states to justify certain exceptional powers outside of the pandemic. So it's an argument I've written about, but I don't have time to go into detail here. But ultimately, what we actually find is the vast majority of states did not derogate from the convention. Okay, this is the full list of the states that did derogate from the convention. I think there's approximately 10 out of 47 states that derogated, and only 2, maybe 3 actually derogated from the right to liberty. Instead, most states did not derogate. Most states basically introduced all these exceptional powers, but justified them under the qualifications or limitations built into the rights. In essence, it's business as usual. And there were lots of arguments made about why states should not derogate in law. So a key argument was about the signal that's sent by derogating. And a lot of lawyers were very concerned that if we declared a formal emergency, it would send out this signal and potentially cause panic. It would also send a signal that human rights were being departed from and being harmed. And this would send the wrong message to less liberal states that they're free to go about abusing emergency powers. So particularly states, for example, like Hungary and Poland. So there was big concern about the symbolic and political cost. For me, that symbolism was overstated, because it essentially suggests that law is able to shape and frames people's understanding of crises. Whereas actually what we know is that the opposite occurs. And actually it's politics that shapes and frames legal actors' understanding of a crisis. We see this with regards to the use of terrorism, for example. When a government uses the term terrorism, very often they're not applying a legal definition. They're applying their political understanding of it. But that political understanding can actually shape legal actors' understanding of what terrorism. So for me, I think a lot of lawyers were overly concerned with formal emergency powers and formal declarations and the signal they were sending, and overlooking actually the harm that these powers, or the risks that these powers could potentially cause if they were to become permanent. So for me, failing to call a spade doesn't make it any less of a spade. And to me, this was because of, high profile abuses of emergency powers. For example, Article 48 in Weimar Germany. And for me, a good example, again, to come back to emergency powers, is people were very concerned about, say, the dictatorship of Caesar. Caesar expressly said, I'm a dictator and I'm abusing my dictatorial powers. He was ultimately murdered, whereas Caesar Augustus, his ultimate successor, kept the trappings of the Roman Republic in place. So he rejected the title of dictator, but nevertheless, he was a much more successful dictator than Caesar ever was. So the argument is basically by failing to understand the relation between law and politics and not expressly acknowledging these formal emergency powers and using the formal quarantining effect, we're risking potentially these powers being used outside of an emergency situation. Now, I don't have too much long left. So my second key point to talk about how emergency powers in the pandemic are different to a national security crisis is this idea of states rushing to end the powers or not even introduce them at all. Because national security emergencies, actually, those kind of powers have this propensity to become permanent. It's the same with economic crises. And that's because economic crises very often are symptomatic of are caused by the status quo that existed before the crisis came into fruition. So those powers are very often transformative. They don't want to go back to what existed beforehand. They want to basically ensure that that doesn't happen again. National security emergencies, again, the democratic forces tend to support these powers becoming permanent. Whereas what we saw, for example, in countries like the UK and other countries, we've seen states that have been slow to react to introduce emergency powers or not even introduce them at all. Sometimes you get human rights arguments thrown out about this. Other times it's economic concerns. And so we need to factor in this rush to normalcy or this failure to react as something that makes pandemics very, very different to national security crises and something that we need to consider. So the UK, for example, in July of 2020 was bringing an end to all its different exceptional emergency provisions, saying we don't need them anymore, but at the very time introducing new permanent counter-terrorist powers. And bearing in mind that in Britain, the death from terrorism from, I don't have the figures at hand, but in about 10 to 15 years prior to 2020, the death from terrorism was less than 100 people in the total time. Essentially, the UK has had days 10 times in excess of that death. I think the death toll today was over 200 alone, and we're acting like the pandemic is over. So it's important to understand this rush to normalcy, these political pressures to lift these powers that we don't see in a national security emergency. And we end up in this loop between essentially ending up with getting the level of the virus down as low as possible, but not defeated. The pressure to reduce them and to get rid of these powers kicks in, the virus increases, and we end up back in this loop again and again and again. And this is not something we see with counter-terrorist powers. So there are a number, therefore, of differences between national security emergencies and pandemics. Again, as I said, the big one is the rush to normalcy. The other one I'm interested in, or these other ones I'm interested in, is the role of executive supremacy. So the executive in a national security crisis likes to claim that it has all this special information that it can't disclose for reasons of national security. In the pandemic, there's no reason to assume that the executive has this sensitive information that it cannot disclose. So that means that constitutional checks like the legislative oversight and judicial oversight should be as strong in a pandemic, arguably, as in a period of normalcy. However, the ability of legislatures to actually sit is deeply problematic because of people gathering together. However, my book does explore that lots of legislatures were able to sit through remote hearings, etc. We also have the very important necessity of an international response to a pandemic. Sometimes national security crisis can be, well, this is for our state and our state alone to deal with, although there has been an international response to terrorism. But from a pandemic perspective, international cooperation is absolutely fundamental. So I'm going to skip through this, but it's this point again that the executive governments claim to have this superiority in a national security emergency. These arguments are much weaker when talking about a pandemic. So these constitutional checks should be as strong as ever. Another interesting thing about the pandemic, and one of the reasons why national security emergency powers may become permanent, is because they tend to be targeted towards a suspect community. Very often, national security powers are introduced, and we don't actually feel they encroach upon our human rights because we're good, law-abiding citizens. They only impact upon the bad, upon the terrorists. They don't actually impact upon our rights. And so they tend to be much more politically palatable. Whereas, as we've seen with pandemic emergency powers, they actually impact upon everybody. And because of that, actually, this is a key force in actually forcing pandemic powers to be temporary, or forcing this rush to normalcy that we don't see in a national security crisis. However, the discretion that these powers give to decision makers in terms of their application can nevertheless be deployed in a discriminatory manner. And we've seen that in the UK with people from ethnic minorities being more likely to be fined than white people under coronavirus laws. We've also seen moral panics around COVID affecting students in universities basically breaching quarantine and essentially being the problem for the spread of the virus. Just to finish up then, legislators have responded to the pandemic in a manner similar to national security crises, conferring broad powers to the executive to deal with the pandemic. However, as I've mentioned, there's no reason why the executive can claim special information that can't necessitate legislative oversight. And legislatures have actually been able to sit. At the outset of the pandemic, there was concern that they couldn't, and that resulted in broad conferral of powers. But actually, we've seen that they can through remote hearings, etc. And this is very important, therefore, to ensure that legislatures can and continue to exercise their functions during a pandemic. It's also important to note that a lot of the rush at the outset was the result of poor pandemic preparedness. So, i.e., there was no emergency response in preparation of the pandemic. Lots of states had failed to prepare for this. And so the next emergency, the next pandemic that occurs, we need to learn the lessons now, and we need to put a pandemic preparedness plan in place. And this will require essentially not just within states, but also international cooperation and potentially international treaties to do so, particularly over issues like, I suppose, controlling borders, financial assistance to states to ensure and facilitate lockdowns, and obviously coordination of resources with things like vaccines, etc. So preparedness is going to be of vital importance for the next emergency. So just to conclude, for me, the risk of permanent emergency powers arising from the pandemic doesn't stem from maybe formal declarations of emergency powers, or even these exceptional pandemic powers becoming permanent. Rather, the risk comes from reinterpreting existing human rights norms and existing standards to allow for these powers, and then that reinterpretation being deployed outside of the pandemic situation to justify emergency powers for less objective threats like national security crisis. So I fear we've potentially lost the quarantining effect of formal states of emergency. It's also important to note that there's actually no correlation between the severity of a lockdown and whether a state derogated from the European Convention on Human Rights. It's also important to note as well that there are very, very strong positive obligations from a human rights perspective to introduce lockdowns. So, for example, to protect the right to life, or to protect individuals from inhuman and degrading treatment in hospitals that become overwhelmed as a result of a pandemic. So too often we hear about lockdown and pandemic powers as solely interfering with our human rights because they're forcing us to stay at home, etc. Very often we do not hear enough about actually the very pro-human rights arguments in favor of protecting people's lives and in favor of protecting people from inhuman and degrading treatment. And for me, the legal symbolic objections to formal declarations of emergency actually overplays law's ability to shape and frame political debates. So there's some image credits for the pictures that I've used, and this is just some of my research that I have written on the pandemic. So I thank you for listening to me, and I'm going to, I think, available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alan Greene. It was excellent. Okay, let's open now to questions, and I have the first. And after this moment, I'll open to the audience. I have already two questions here from our international relations students. So, Dr. Allen, while your presentation, I was thinking about what said the Italian thinker and philosopher Giorgio Agamben. I read so much Agamben, plural interests in my research about international relations, pandemics, religion, and their effects. So while your presentation about a state of emergency, I was thinking if there is some differences or some similarities with the conception of a state of exception from Giorgio Agamben. There is something, you know what I mean, right?
Yes. So yes, I've worked with Agamben, and Agamben is very much influenced by Schmitt.
Yeah.
And for me, I think that's part of almost the problem with how we've reacted to the pandemic is viewing it through this Schmittian lens, viewing it through this state of exception. Basically, I found myself in the very, very weird position in March 2020 of arguing in favor of states of emergency when my whole career up until that point has been, that's not an emergency, that's not an emergency, that's not an emergency. But I think, and I've written about this, I think that the impact of Schmitt and Agamben, they're very much concerned about essentially national security crisis, or essentially the threat from the other. So particularly Schmitt's distinction between friend and enemy, and the problems that arise from that. His idea that we need a homogeneous state in order to have the necessary degree of stability to establish the state upon, and therefore we need a powerful executive or a powerful sovereign beyond the law to distinguish friend and enemy, to get rid of the enemy. Now, Schmitt's exception is what I like to term a zone beyond law. It's about power that exists beyond the state. And that's a very worrying power. It's a very concerning power. And my first book was about constructing a constitutional emergency regime to avoid the zone beyond law. However, a lot of emergencies aren't actually the state of exception beyond the law. A lot of emergencies have lots of law, and particularly derogations under international human rights treaties. There's lots of law involved in that. And I think the fear of the Schmitt, the fear of the state of exception, which is something that I very much am concerned about, has maybe thwarted our ability to actually realize that actually formal emergencies where we do have law, where we can have the constitutional checks and balances, where the executive cannot claim all this special information that all other branches should defer to. In that instance, then, that actually there's something different about pandemics, that yes, we need to have formal emergency powers, but those and international norms. So I think my answer to, and I think Agamben ultimately in this pandemic has been actually quite skeptical. And I think that's as a result of essentially being obsessed with the friend-enemy distinction that I don't think is very helpful for trying to understand the pandemic and the necessity of these powers to deal with this crisis, that if isn't dealt with, will objectively lead to a humanitarian crisis that we are seeing in states around the world. So I think I've answered your question, I hope.
Yes, sure. I think the first Agamben's position about pandemics was something kind of he was disappointed. I think he was disappointed with the state's position about getting a state of emergency, and at the same time, some countries, I mean, unequal countries, the state of exceptions. I don't know how to get a position, yeah, and Agamben's position was kind of disappointed with the states. He kind of disagree about those contexts, about those situations, about close everything, about everything stopped almost at the outbreak of the economic crisis, and he was questioning himself, like, what is this? The state could be the strongest part, you know what I mean? And I was confusing reading about his opinion about the reaction of states. And when you said about coronavirus almost brought down the global financial system, I immediately remembered about Agamben's position. Agamben's his reaction was kind of very awkward. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I didn't understand. I'm right. I didn't understand his reaction about. It's like he was getting his theory, all the literature, his writings, and I don't know, put in the trash can, and maybe, sorry to talking about this, like put in the trash can, but he was denying, all most of the part of his theory, So I would like to. Could you make some comments about this? Have you realized Agamben's position about coronavirus crisis?
So I've read, the last time I read it was back at the outset of the crisis. So I'm not 100% sure if I'm able to comment on it specifically, but I can see I think it comes from Agamben's skepticism of law, and I suppose maybe state power and states' claim to power. So Agamben is all about that emergencies are essentially subjective. Okay.
Sure, yeah.
For me, and I write about this in my first book, I think Agamben goes too far with the subjectivity of emergency. There's definitely subjective elements there, but I think there's an objective threat. So I would take a constructivist approach to emergency. There is something objective, an objective crisis that exists out there, but that's influenced and impacted by the subjectiveness of the decision maker. Agamben's work is all about the subjectivity of the decision maker. which I think is understandable in national security crisis. When you actually can't stress test the existence of the threat, you have to rely upon the executive saying, we have all this information, you have to trust us. And Agamben's work is all about critiquing that. For me, because he goes too far down the subjective thing, I think that's what's clouded his ability to see the actual, there is an objective threat out here that needs tackling, that needs confronting. And that's why I think the constructivist approach is better. And it's why taking this constructivist approach to emergencies, which is what I do, I'm able to say, this is an emergency. This needs an emergency response.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean I'm endorsing every time the state declares an emergency. And this is the very first time I've actually done that. All my work up beforehand is like, this isn't an emergency. This isn't an emergency. This isn't an emergency. So okay. I think that
perfect.
Might answer.
Yeah, that's okay. Yes, sure. And okay, I'll give the floor to our Professor Elton, please.
Thank you very much, Pedro. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Greene for your excellent exposition. And my questions deals with the individual guarantees and rights and how it can be preserved in situations like this under the pandemic. In your opinion, Professor, is there a risk that the restrictive sanitary measures will create the idea of permanent emergency or some kind of standby emergency, paving the way for authoritarianism or even for the decreasing in the quality of democracy?
Yes, so I think the risk stems from the precedent of these powers being introduced, being used to outside of pandemic situations. And this is why my research places a heavy emphasis on formal declarations of emergency that have unfortunately not been used. Because that formal declaration, that formal requirement that a public emergency threatening the life of the nation must exist, to allow those powers, if that isn't in existence, if that hasn't been declared, then those powers can't come into existence. My main concern is that we've ended up introducing all these powers, and although they will be lifted, and I think, and the powers are necessary, I think, and ultimately I think they will be lifted, because we've lacked that quarantining effect of a formal declaration of an emergency. I am concerned that the precedent will be used outside of a pandemic situation. So, for example, already we've seen a case before the European Court of Human Rights regarding lockdown, where the court didn't even say that it was compatible with Article 5. They basically said it was inadmissible, that there's been no breach of rights here. The right hasn't even been triggered. It hasn't even been interfered with. And to me, that's very, very, very problematic. So I'm in the position where I argue these powers are necessary, but we need to introduce them in the correct legal form. And I don't think that states have done that. And my concern is what happens later. It mightn't be that these COVID powers become permanent, but something in a couple of years, maybe looking like them, will potentially become permanent, and the infrastructure will be there. A best example of that might be things like the over here we had contact tracing apps, and essentially to track people's movements and where people were logging in or not, so that they would get pinged on their app and say, you've been next to someone you need to quarantine. All that data, all that infrastructure could be potentially utilized in a national security context. And whether that precedent and that data and that information will be used outside of the pandemic is something that we need to keep an eye on, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I have some more questions. I mean, students are asking some questions, so I'm gonna reproduce them here.
Great.
The first question is from student Leonardo Alencar. The question is, how could you explain the recent surge of protest against restrictive measures and the use of emergency powers in developed countries compared to developing countries?
That's an excellent question. And I think a lot of this comes down to the fact that the powers are affecting us all. And there's a thing, as we call them in English, lockdown skeptics. And very often they're phrased or framed as as libertarians, that they inherently do not like the state interfering with their rights. And you're seeing that very much in the United States, where libertarianism is quite dominant. You're also seeing it in the UK. However, for me, this libertarianism it's not consistent libertarianism. And it's not consistent because if they were consistent, they'd be as concerned about permanent counterterrorism powers as they are about COVID powers. They're perfectly happy with permanent counterterrorist powers because they don't affect them. And it's because those powers affect the bad terrorists, the bad suspect community. Because COVID emergency powers affect us all, only now do they suddenly realize that they're actually concerned about human rights. So for me, it's not a consistent ideological position. They need to be concerned about them all. I think a lot of it, therefore, is as a result of that. There's also a degree of kind of a populist resurgence against this. So this idea that skepticism of what elites and experts are telling people what to do. And so we don't trust those experts. We don't trust those elites. And then obviously there's misinformation. Misinformation is abounding on the internet, and that is helping to fuel and perpetuate it. So I think that's ultimately what probably is explaining a lot of what's known as COVID skepticism. I don't think it looks like it's libertarianism. I don't think it is at all. It's a bit inconsistent. And I think it's maybe more populism than it is libertarianism.
Right. Thank you very much. The second question comes from another student, Anderline. She asks, as a lawyer, how do you say these attempts to force the population to get vaccinated?
Yes. So for me, this is about viewing law as the carrot and the stick. And very often as lawyers, and particularly when we talk about things like criminal law and we're talking about coercion, we tend to view law as the stick rather than maybe viewing things in terms of incentives. So the idea of forced vaccinations to me is perhaps a bit premature before you've maybe exhausted more incentives. So there are other ways you can encourage people to get vaccinated before you have to go down the route of forced vaccinations. So whether it's proportionate at the minute I think it's questionable. Ultimately, I do have some unease about the forced vaccinations for everybody. Again, things like blanket rules under human rights law are problematic, but there might be other ways in which it can be done. So, for example, you have to have a vaccination to get into certain events, or maybe certain professions require it. Doing it that way rather than a blanket prohibition is probably a more human rights compatible way than introducing a blanket forced vaccination requirement, because ultimately there are people as well who for medical reasons can't get vaccinated. And it's also important as well, the vaccination skepticism is quite strong in certain communities that have maybe not had a great relationship with the state. Their only view of state power up until this point has been through maybe persecution, or at least a feeling of oppression. So, for example, maybe particularly in the UK, Black and Asian ethnic groupings, there is a much lower COVID uptake. But bearing in mind that they're the groups that are disproportionately affected by things like stop and search powers, etc., their only interaction with the state for lots of these people are negative. And ultimately, we're coming along and then telling them that you actually need to trust the state. So that's kind of why I think there is this resistance in certain communities. It's a bit late now for me to saying, well, maybe if the state had better relations. But again, this will be relevant, I think, for the next pandemic, for the next preparedness, which might help improve relations and not going down this forced route.
And around the perspective of individual freedoms, we have the next question here on the screen. Around the perspective of individual freedoms, individual rights, and the consequences of this enforcement in long terms. What do you think about the enforcement in long terms?
So
I think you said something. I think you brought something in your explanation about psychological consequences and.
Yeah, so this is quite interesting. So originally, I would have thought that we get quite used to permanent emergency powers, even those that affect us. So, for example, anytime we want to get on an airplane, we don't think twice about going through all the different rigorous security. Whereas with the pandemic, I think I'm not sure whether people are getting so used to them. So particularly in the UK and in Ireland, we're seeing a decline in mask wearing. Even if, particularly in Ireland, it's still required. So some people are gaining some kind of fatigue there that maybe we don't see in relation to other emergency powers. However, I also know that that's not necessarily the case in other states, and very often it might vary from state to state, and it might actually be the individual culture within a state. There are other states where actually it is just normal to wear masks in different communities. So I think this is a question really for behavioral scientists to actually answer, rather than maybe a lawyer. But I do know in the UK, their response to the pandemic initially was based upon behavioral science, and were like, all their models, or at least they claimed their models, were telling them that people would not stick with lockdown. They will get sick of this. We need to leave it until the last minute. And their models were wrong. And actually people proved a lot more resilient and a lot more willing to stick with these measures and accept these measures than otherwise they would be. So I think behavioral economists have come in for a lot of a beating over here in the past 2 years. So I think they'd probably be better than myself at answering that question.
Okay, thank you once more. And the last question. Let me see here. Professor Rodolfo brought us this question. Diogo, tu pode colocar? Okay, here on the screen, on my cell phone, has a trouble here now. So how do you see a situation in which the leader of a nation says the enemy is not the virus, it's just a code, but those oppressed NGOs, scientists, politicians who advocate for preventive measures?
Yes, that's a deeply problematic issue. But I think my answer to that would be, this is why the executive does not have and should not have a monopoly on expertise in a time of crisis like a pandemic. And ultimately, this is where the other constitutional branches have to step in and hold them to account, and ultimately the people as well. And that's so much easier said than done, but I think this demonstrates the limits of law, that lawyers can only say so much, and law can basically state what should happen, but ultimately the legitimacy of law and the force of law is dependent upon factors outside of law. So unfortunately, I do not have a magic bullet. If you were to say, well, actually, there is a very strong human rights obligation to protect these rights, and you bring in those human rights arguments and you get the legal judgment against the individual, maybe an injunction to compel them to do so, whether to do or not is a different question. But ultimately, executive does not have monopoly on expertise in a pandemic, and I sympathise with that situation. Sorry, I do not have a magic magic bullet to fix it.
Perfect. I understand. I know what you mean. Because we have lots of contradictions here in Brazil, because our executive says something, our scientist says something different, our, NGOs, press, we have different institutions and different political actors. Yeah, we have a diversity of speeches, especially here in Latin America and in Brazil. And it makes the scenario very complicated to think about. Inequalities and democracy, the health of democracy. Our democracy is very fragile, and it's very complicated to think about it. To make a theory very applicable to our scenario, the Brazilian democracy, the Brazilian political scenario, it's very complicated right now, but I completely understand what you mean. Yeah. So we are ending our opening panel, and I would like to thank you very much, Dr. Alan Greene, for your fantastic speech. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you more speaking about democracy and international relations, pandemics, and bring us more something interesting themes. And so that's it.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the really interesting perspective from international relations. I really enjoy it, and I wish you all the best for the conference.
All right, thank you very much once more, Professor Elton.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greene, for your outstanding speak of this night. On behalf of our General Director, Sister Miriam Vieira, I would like to congratulate you again and say that our doors will be always open to hear you speak a little bit more about democracy, international relations, and the limits of the freedom.
Thank you.
Então, pessoal, muito obrigado pela audiência de vocês. Agora falando em português, obrigado pela audiência. Queria lembrar que às 8h30 a gente tem a segunda mesa sobre refugiados e imigrantes, né, com a professora Ana Carolina Leite e o professor Hermes Moreira Júnior, já às 8h30. Dr. Alam just explained that our next panel is about refugees and migrants, and we have two Brazilian doctors to explain and make their speeches about. So, pessoal, até já, às 8h30, na segunda mesa sobre refugiados e imigrantes. Obrigado pela audiência de vocês e até a próxima.
Obrigado, pessoal. Até breve. Tchau, tchau.